Hi everyone, and welcome to today's video. It's going to be a little bit different to normal, a more informal demonstration. Usually I cover specific topics, kind of within a painting, certain aspects of how to produce a painting. But today is actually going to be kind of more of an overview, and more of a sort of just pure demonstration. So I'm going to be painting a sort of kind of oil wash sketch of a landscape. I'm going to be working indoors, but this approach, given how quickly you can do it and the sort of size board that I'm going to be using, panel, it's very sort of a really good approach if you do go outdoors and do some plein air painting. I'm hoping to produce some videos in the future that will actually be painted outdoors, so you can see this kind of approach actually enacted in real life. But for the time being, I thought it would be good to kind of produce an overview in the studio. But my approach will be the same as the approach I would take if I was working from nature. Obviously today I'm going to be using a reference photo, but it's roughly the same kind of process that we're going to be going through. So to begin with, I'll just quickly show you the image that I'm going to be working from. A bit of reflection there on my computer, but it gives you the idea. So a fairly straightforward, quite traditional landscape. Got some water, sky, some trees. It's quite overcast. I'll be talking a bit more about conditions of landscape painting as I go. And I'll also just be sort of covering the general principles behind landscape painting, so some things that you should always bear in mind when working from a landscape. Some principles that will make things easier for you. So to begin with, I'm going to go through my materials. And I'll start with my palette. So I'm going to be using my sort of standard landscape palette, which begins, well, pretty much all my palettes include titanium white. So I think I've got my palette in view. I've got a little bit already on there, so I won't actually put too much out. I keep a very messy palette. Some people keep very clean palettes, but sort of a personal thing how you paint. And I'll be using ivory black. A lot of landscape artists don't actually use black, particularly anyone who follows more of an impressionist approach. But I do find black a useful colour to have. It makes nice subtle blues. Ivory black and titanium white mix to form a blue. And it's also quite good for quickly neutralising any other colours that you've mixed. It only really overly greys things down if you allow it to, otherwise it can actually be a real boon to your paintings. So if I now go through my blues, I'll use Prussian blue, which is very useful for mixing greens. When used in conjunction with cadmium yellow, makes for a nice green. I've got some ultramarine blue, which gives me a slightly cooler blue for skies, and slightly different greens if necessary. I'll then be using some burnt umber as well as some raw umber. It's quite a kind of expansive palette, this. They don't need to be this big. It just speeds things up a bit if you've got these earth colours. The earth colours can obviously be mixed from the high chroma colours that you have in your palette. So I've got some burnt sienna, just a tiny bit of that because I don't think I'll be using very many reds at all. I'm not actually going to put, sometimes I'd use cadmium red, particularly for kind of more golden landscapes, but today this one's quite kind of mostly browns and greens and some blues, so I'm not actually going to go into that kind of extreme red that I would get. Definitely be using some yellow ochre as a great colour for landscapes, and I'll be using cad yellow, as I mentioned before. Because it mixes very nicely to form some greens. I also have, in addition, on my landscape palette, I sometimes have a, I don't know if you can see it in focus there, there we go, some Old Holland green light, which is actually quite a cheap pre-mixed green, quite high chroma as you can see. Can be quite useful if straight out of the tube the colours that you're looking at match it. Today I don't think I'll need it, but I might add it later on and we'll see. So that's all my paints distributed erratically across my palette. I'll mostly be mixing in this area, so you can sort of see how I'm mixing. You can see I've been doing some landscapes recently because it's already green. And now I've also got a little palette cup here just filled with some mineral spirits. As I say, it's more of a washy landscape piece, so this is something that maybe you could finish in one sitting, would be the idea. Or if you needed to, it kind of just gives you a foundation to then add more detail. My typical approach is to produce a wash painting like the one I'm going to do today in maybe an hour or two, because the conditions, they don't change too quickly, or they don't change too significantly over that period of time. And then from there I can maybe go back and refine some details in the studio just to bring some focus to the image, because one thing that tends to be a bit lacking in these sorts of wash sketches is detail. So you can actually manage to generally capture the colours. The main purpose of these sorts of sketches when you're outdoors is to capture the colour relationships and the value relationships. Don't worry so much about shapes. Cameras can sort of do that for you, so I don't have a problem with students using a black and white photo, but using colour sketches just gives a more kind of human perspective on your landscape, whereas if you just use your camera, you're kind of relying on how the camera sees the landscape, how the white balance has worked. You can fiddle around with that in Photoshop or Lightroom, but it's not quite the same as actually observing the colour relationships and the value relationships in real life with your own eyes. The human eye is very good at adjusting exposure as it looks in an entire scene, so you can look at dark trees and a light sky in the same scene and it makes sense. If you try to photograph it, the camera will expose to either the darker trees and blow out the lights, or it'll expose to the lights and make everything else too dark. So you'll notice this if you try to, say, take a photograph of a landscape with a bright sky. If you expose so that the clouds are beautifully rendered, the landscape will end up too dark, and vice versa. If you expose so that the landscape is clearly rendered, the sky will end up too light. There are ways of working around this in photography, so you have high dynamic range photography, and to a certain extent that's kind of what we do when we paint. So we're capable of combining different shall we say, observations of the scene in one painting and producing something that seems closer to reality than a photograph often does, certainly if it's brought to a finish. But it's being able to look at the colours and capturing the colours as you see them that is the real kind of advantage of working outdoors. Even if you're working in a very traditional representational manner, there is a substantial difference between photography and painting, and that goes for all types of photography actually, still life, portraiture. The fact that you're working from your own eye rather than from a camera makes a big difference. Having said that, today I'm obviously working from a photo, but I'm going to be painting it imagining I'm not working from a photo. I'm actually painting a landscape that I know quite well because it's very close to me, so it's in my head how the landscape looks and how the colours work. I think a large part of the success of a landscape painting is how immersed you are in the location, and how you're able to look at things and remember how they look when you then kind of go to actually paint it. So you could even go out and sit in a field for 3 hours, come back and paint probably a decent version of it at home, just because it's sort of etched in your mind. But yeah, I'll get going, so I end up talking for too long. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of roughly block in all the largest shapes in the painting, just using some diluted raw umber. So I just wiped a bit of it off my brush just there. So as I say, I'm not going to be so fussy about positioning of my shapes. I'm going to worry a bit more about my colours, getting a nice set of colours. So you notice I'm trying to hold the brush really far back. I recommend that as much as possible. Had some red on this brush from the other day, it hasn't been cleaned quite right. that it matters too much. I go back to a more umbery colour. So yeah, I'm holding the brush quite far back and trying to just do fairly sketchy where possible, quite sketchy lines. So I'm just painting in these kind of clumps of forest on the far shore. Just figuring out where they are. Go back to this foreground set of trees. I'm being really loose with my shapes. I generally say with everything that you do to stay general as you begin. There's no point going into a great deal of detail. Just block roughly how these trees look. I'm just gonna, can't actually see it, but there is, in this lower left-hand portion of the painting, you do actually see the reservoir behind the tree, so I'm just roughly getting an idea of where that far shore kind of connects to it. And then I'll go and add this ground plane. And just quickly block in these little smaller, and they're still trees, but they've just not grown up quite as much as the other plantation trees. So yeah, that pretty much blocks in all the major shapes. Obviously you've got these kind of distinct trees sort of overlapping one another. Little bits of light showing through. So I might block those in a little bit as well. And go back up here, turn to the, I guess what you call the background, top of that hillside, and we've got just a little bit of the distant hills. Just behind there, and this is our sky. So that's basically all I would ever necessarily, all I'd ever really want to do as far as a drawing goes, this sort of sketch, so I can get straight into painting. But it gives me a guide to work from, so I now kind of have a much better general idea of where all the different shapes are going to go as I start to paint them. Whereas if I'd started painting straight away, I might not have been able to kind of correctly position all the clumps of trees relative to each other. But this is a pretty decent start for that kind of thing. One thing that people tend to have a lot of trouble with when they first start painting is actually being able to kind of take their whole field of vision, if they're sitting and looking at this big expansive landscape, and getting it to fit into this rectangle, which is their panel that they're painting on. Actually, before I put too much paint on it, this is a homemade panel. It's on birch plywood, and then just braced at the back and primed with some golden gesso. And they make for a really good, versatile painting panel that you can take outdoors. They're fairly light, they're robust, they're a really nice surface to paint on. You can kind of get a different surface depending on how much you sand or smooth out the gesso. This is actually quite rough. I like a fairly kind of sticky surface to paint on. And I've allowed the brush strokes and the gesso to kind of remain visible, I think you can see. Just to give a bit more texture, it's a bit more like the tooth of a canvas when you're painting rather than a really slippery smooth surface. But yeah, they're really good. I might do a lesson at one point actually of how to prepare panels for painting on. Particularly as these are really good for landscape painting, which is something we'll be carrying on with lessons with. But yeah, so to get back to this, basically it just gives you a guide so before you start slapping paint on you know how everything's positioned. And as I was saying, it can be difficult to figure out exactly how to fit the part of the scene that you want to paint into the image when you're sort of sitting outdoors. One thing people do is they sometimes use viewfinders, or you can use your hand to kind of block things in. The more you do it, the more you'll get used to it. It's something that once you actually can do it, you won't really understand why you ever had trouble with it, but it certainly is something that people have a lot of trouble with when they first start painting. So either using tools or using a phone actually can be quite useful sometimes. So if you take a quick photo with your phone or your camera, that creates a box view to then work from, and helps you just kind of keep in your mind where those limit points are for your image. The thing I generally do is I think you just think to yourself, I'm going to end the painting at this tree here, at this clump, and I'm going to stop at this shrub, and then you know that those are the two boundary points for your image, and then that'll basically create where your horizontals will go based on those vertical limits. You can just sort of think, well, that clump of trees now runs maybe sort of almost 2/3 of the way to that shrub, which is my right hand limit, and then they're so tall relative to their width. And you can basically, from there, once you've got a few shapes blocked in, then it's a lot easier to keep control of that sort of stuff. But yeah, so the next thing we're going to do is, I'm working from a kind of cloudy sky, which is quite light, which means I'm not actually going to alter the white of the canvas. Sometimes you can work on a toned panel, which might be toned brown or grey, something like that. That can be a bit easier for people to judge value. This one is just a good example of if you only have a white canvas to work from, you can still produce a fairly well-balanced image. Some painting schools actually only really used white panels and canvases, so Pre-Raphaelites, if you go and look at any of their pieces, particularly Mallet, he didn't tone his canvases before he painted them, he just painted straight over white. And they do glow really nicely. It can suit landscapes to be painted over white because the kind of washy, scrubby painting we're going to do today, the texture really shows through very clearly in a white painting. Whereas if you have a kind of neutral, middle value under painting, you don't get that kind of sort of washy texture when you do the first layer, which can be nice. It gives kind of the general effect of foliage or grass, which you'll see a bit later. I'll kind of go through how you can scrub things in. I'm just going to shift this slightly. Good. Slight adjustment. Make it a bit clearer for you guys to see. Yeah, so we're going to start blocking in colours. As I say, I'm going to leave the sky and the water white for the time being because that's going to be definitely the lightest part of my image. And I'll begin by blocking in these darker shapes in these trees in the foreground. So I'll pick out those trees I feel are the darkest and start with them. So as I said, I get my kind of base green mixture from cadmium yellow, Prussian blue. So I can try that out on the surface. If it comes up, that looks a bit too blue-green, I can darken it and tone it down a bit with a bit of burnt umber. So that's more what I'm after. So some of these tree shapes are lighter than others. I'm going through and just trying to, not too fastidiously, but generally sort of keep an eye on those portions which seem the darkest and begin with those. So I think that's kind of roughly all the darkest shapes that I have to deal with. I might also go through and just get some of these. Maybe a little portion in there actually. Some of these tree trunks, scrappy little tree trunks. So now I'll move down to a slightly lighter shade. Start blocking that in as well. So even slightly lighter again. Tree kind of hidden behind that first darker one I got in. That's a similar value to some of these little ones up front. Possibly the younger trees retain their more sap green foliage. You can start to mix any of these greens that you've already kind of got in. I'm going to return to my darker green. Get this kind of shoreline that's sort of in shadow in as well.